Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week I just wanted to go through a painting from beginning to end and just talk about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Again, not because I'm saying this is how you should paint a watercolor landscape, it's just this is how I go about that process. And maybe there's something interesting for some people in that. So it's quite a small piece of paper. It's a sort of medium surface, so it's not entirely smooth, but certainly not a rough surface. It is quite a heavy paper, and it's Hahnemühle paper. But again, I'm not saying that to say you have to go out and buy Hahnemühle paper. Whatever watercolor paper you like to use is fine. As I've said before, and as I showed in another video, the surface of the paper is more important than the brand of paper. So if you're using like this, a sort of medium to smooth paper, you're going to get a very different result from someone who's using a rough paper. It's not that one's better or anything, it's just you'll get different results. You have to make that decision, which one you want to use. As always, I'm not using any references, so I'm just making things up as I go along. That's why I put on lines and then I get rid of some of the lines and make a mess of things and so on and so on. It's just the way I do things. Even if I had a reference photograph or two, I probably wouldn't use them. And even if I did, the final painting would end up looking something completely different to what the reference photo would look like. I really don't like the idea of just copying things. To me, if you want to copy things, just get a photocopier, maybe. I like things to come out of my head, sort of imagination. But anyway, once I've sort of got a composition that I'm reasonably happy with, then I start putting in some foreground details. Again, just sticking to blue for now. Because you saw at the beginning I used a little spray bottle to soak the top of the paper, but the bottom half of the paper is kind of dry. It's not that wet. So that means I can do sort of dry brushwork. And again, that creates a bit of implied detail, a feeling of maybe some vegetation or something like that. Other things I do then is scratching the paper. Again, if you're scratching, I just use my fingernails. Some people use old plastic credit cards, that type of thing. Whatever you're using, if you have a smooth or a sort of medium surface paper, you can do that and you'll get nice, distinct scratch marks. If you're using a rough paper, you won't really be able to do that because the paper already has that sort of rough texture to it, and you won't get nice, crisp scratch marks. So again, it's not that one is better or good or anything like that. It's just being aware of the differences that the surface of the paper makes to the final painting. Scratch marks are there just again to imply some sort of detail in the foreground. By putting in that sort of implied detail in the foreground and not in the middle ground or the background, it sort of sets the foreground apart from the middle and backgrounds, and that kind of helps to create a bit of a feeling of depth in the painting. And that's really all I'm using in this painting, to kind of get that feeling of depth. There isn't really much in the way of linear perspective or aerial perspective going on here. Another thing worth maybe pointing out is with watercolor, how much pigment, what's the ratio of sort of pigment, the paint that you're using, and the water in the brush and on the paper, because that will determine how saturated the color is. If everything is sort of washed out and slightly greyish, you'll end up with a painting that's maybe a little bit boring to look at. On the other hand, I think if you put in everything as very intense color, like the yellow that I put on, to me it looks a bit amateurish. If if everything is completely saturated. It's maybe better to have a mixture of little patches of saturated color with more sort of washed out grayish bits as well. That variety, I think, just makes the final painting a bit more interesting. Another thing you can use to try and create a sense of sort of variety is to think about the edges that you have. So if you're putting watercolor paint onto dry paper, you'll usually get harder edges. If it's onto wet paper, the pigment sort of diffuses and spreads out and you get those softer edges. And if you have a variety of hard and soft edges, again, it adds in that feeling of variety and a bit more interest into the painting. At least that's how I sort of look at it. Okay, but this sort of point in the painting, it's getting to where I have to start thinking about stopping. Is there anything else that I need to add? And if I keep adding stuff, is that going to ruin the painting? Is it going to start looking overworked, kind of thing? So at this point, I wasn't completely happy with how some of the blue and the yellow had mixed in that distant field, so I thought if I put on some more yellow, it might help to harden up the edge of the field a little bit. I also then decided maybe I would put on some dabs of yellow in the foreground, again to sort of create this feeling of implied detail and trying to separate the foreground from the middle ground and the background. There's always, everything you do with the painting, there's always the chance that you'll ruin the painting. That's just the way painting is. There isn't much you can do about that. You can be going along fantastically and then you put on one bit and it just sort of ruins the whole painting. And that's the battle of trying to do art. So a scan of the final painting, I would say probably I was 70% happy. There was bits of it that were good, bits of it not so good. But again, that's, you know, all part of the process of creating art. Not every painting is going to be one of your favorites, sort of thing. It's all a learning process. Okay, well, if you made it this far, thank you for watching the video. Hopefully some of the ideas might be some use to somebody. Thank you for watching and hopefully see you in the next video.